Imagine if a single wedding ceremony could change the course of an entire nation's history forever. That's exactly what happened on a cold January morning in 1533, when King Henry VIII secretly married Anne Boleyn in a small chamber at Whitehall Palace. This wasn't just any royal wedding. It was the moment that would tear England away from the Roman Catholic Church and reshape Christianity across an entire kingdom. If you're fascinated by pivotal moments that changed everything, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible historical turning points. Let's set the scene. It's the early 1530s, and King Henry VIII has been desperately trying to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, for almost 6 years. After nearly 24 years of marriage, Catherine has only given him one surviving child, a daughter named Mary. In an age where male heirs were essential for royal succession, Henry believes he needs a son to secure the Tudor dynasty. But there's a massive problem. The Pope absolutely refuses to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine. Pope Clement VII faces enormous pressure from Catherine's powerful nephew, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who controls much of Europe and would be furious if his aunt were cast aside. For years, Henry has been sending ambassadors to Rome, arguing that his marriage to Catherine was never valid because she had briefly been married to his deceased brother Arthur. The king genuinely believes God is punishing him for this unlawful union by denying him male heirs. Meanwhile, Anne Boleyn has captured Henry's complete attention. She's intelligent, witty, and captivating, but she's made it clear she won't become just another royal mistress. If Henry wants her, he'll have to marry her and make her his queen. Anne Boleyn isn't like other women at court. She spent years in the sophisticated French court, where she learned to be charming, educated, and strategic. She knows exactly how to keep Henry's interest while maintaining her virtue and her ultimate goal, becoming Queen of England. By late 1532, the situation becomes desperate. Anne discovers she's pregnant, and both she and Henry know this child must be born legitimate to have any claim to the English throne. If this baby is a boy, he could be the male heir Henry has dreamed of for decades. They make a momentous decision that will echo through history. Since the Pope won't grant Henry's divorce, they'll take matters into their own hands. On January 25, 1533, in the early hours of a winter morning, King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn were secretly married at Whitehall Palace. The ceremony took place in the highest chamber of the Holbein Gate, a magnificent 3-story gatehouse Henry had constructed the year before. Only a handful of witnesses were present, perhaps just a priest, Anne's father Thomas Boleyn, and maybe 1 or 2 trusted courtiers. Picture this intimate scene. Anne wore a simple gown, not the elaborate dress you'd expect for a royal wedding, because this had to appear like nothing special was occurring. The priest quietly spoke the traditional marriage vows while the future of English Christianity hung in the balance. When Henry took Anne's hand and promised to love and honor her as his wife, he was simultaneously taking the first step toward breaking England's 1,000-year connection to the Roman Catholic Church. Anne was already showing early signs of pregnancy, and both desperately hoped this child would be the son they needed to justify everything they were about to put their kingdom through. The secrecy surrounding this wedding was absolutely crucial. Henry was still technically married to Catherine of Aragon in the Catholic Church's eyes, making him guilty of bigamy, a serious crime with catastrophic political consequences. If word leaked out, it could trigger civil war or invite invasion from Catholic powers across Europe. For months, Anne continued appearing at court as if nothing had changed. She dressed normally, participated in usual activities, and gave no outward sign she was now England's secret queen. Only those who knew the truth were sworn to absolute silence under penalty of death. But as spring 1533 arrived, Anne's pregnancy became impossible to hide. Her dresses grew looser, and careful court observers began whispering among themselves. The secret that would change everything was slowly becoming visible to the entire kingdom. On May 23, 1533, the newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, made a declaration that sent shockwaves across Europe. In a formal ecclesiastical court, Cranmer proclaimed that King Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon had never been valid and was therefore null and void. 5 days later, on May 28th, Cranmer made an even more dramatic announcement. He declared that Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn was completely legal and valid. With these two declarations, England's religious establishment officially recognized Anne as the true and only Queen of England. The reaction from Rome was swift and devastating. Pope Clement VII immediately excommunicated both Henry VIII and Archbishop Cranmer from the Catholic Church. In the medieval world, excommunication meant eternal damnation, a fate worse than death. But Henry had already made his choice. Rather than submit to papal authority, he decided to create an entirely new religious structure for England. Don't forget to subscribe if you're enjoying this incredible story, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. On June 1, 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England in one of the most spectacular coronation ceremonies in English history. Westminster Abbey was decorated with tapestries, flowers, and golden ornaments. Anne processed down the aisle wearing a purple velvet mantle over a crimson gown, with her long dark hair flowing under a golden circlet. The ceremony was magnificent, but underneath lay enormous tension. Many nobles were deeply uncomfortable, watching as Anne knelt to receive the sacred oils and crown, knowing this moment was simultaneously the birth of a new queen and the death of England's connection to Rome. 3 months later, on September 7, 1533, Anne gave birth to the child whose conception had triggered this entire religious revolution. But there was crushing disappointment. The baby was not the male heir Henry desperately needed. Instead, Anne delivered a healthy daughter. Henry tried to hide his disappointment, but those closest could see the frustration in his eyes. He had risked everything: his relationship with the Catholic Church, his standing among European monarchs, his kingdom's stability, all for the promise of a son. Instead, he had another daughter. Little did anyone know that this baby girl, named Elizabeth, would grow up to become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. But in 1533, all Henry could see was another female heir and the political problems that would create. The religious consequences continued unfolding throughout 1533 and 1534. Parliament began passing revolutionary laws that would fundamentally transform England's relationship with Christianity. The most significant was the Act of Supremacy, passed in 1534, declaring King Henry VIII the supreme head of the Church of England. This wasn't just political maneuvering, it was complete theological revolution. For over 1,000 years, English Christians had been part of the Universal Catholic Church. Now they were told their king was their spiritual leader, and the Pope had no power over them whatsoever. The transformation of English Christianity accelerated rapidly after Anne's coronation. Monasteries that had existed for centuries suddenly found themselves under attack. Beginning in 1536, Henry launched what became known as the dissolution of the monasteries. Royal commissioners traveled throughout England, finding excuses to close religious communities. Ancient libraries containing irreplaceable manuscripts were scattered or destroyed. Beautiful churches that had stood for hundreds of years were stripped of their lead roofs, their stones carted away. The physical landscape of England was transformed as religious houses vanished, but the human cost was even greater. Thousands of religious men and women found themselves suddenly homeless. The elaborate network of charity and education the monasteries had provided disappeared almost overnight. Meanwhile, Anne Boleyn's position was becoming increasingly precarious. Henry grew frustrated with her failure to produce male heirs. She had suffered at least one miscarriage, and Henry began wondering if God was still punishing him despite his break with Rome. The king's wandering eye focused on a new woman at court, Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting. Jane was everything Anne was not: quiet, submissive, and seemingly uncomplicated. As Henry's interest in Jane grew, Anne's future became uncertain. By early 1536, Henry had convinced himself that his second marriage was as cursed as his first. Anne had suffered another miscarriage, and Henry interpreted this as divine displeasure. More importantly, he was desperately in love with Jane Seymour and determined to marry her. The solution was as brutal as it was effective. In May 1536, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, incest with her brother George, and treason. The evidence was almost certainly fabricated, but Henry's courts condemned her anyway. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was beheaded at the Tower of London. The woman whose pregnancy had triggered the English Reformation was dead just 3 years after her coronation, but the religious revolution she had inadvertently started continued without her. The very next day after Anne's execution, Henry became engaged to Jane Seymour. 10 days later, they were married in a quiet ceremony at Whitehall Palace, the same location where Henry and Anne had held their secret wedding. Jane would give Henry the male heir he had always wanted, Prince Edward, born in 1537. But she died shortly after childbirth, leaving Henry with the son he believed would secure his dynasty. By the time Henry VIII died in 1547, England had been completely transformed. The country that had once been one of the Pope's most loyal kingdoms was now defiantly Protestant, with its own independent church answering only to the English crown. But perhaps the most extraordinary irony is that the baby whose illegitimate conception had triggered the English Reformation would herself become one of the greatest monarchs in world history. Elizabeth I, Anne Boleyn's daughter, would rule England for 45 years and preside over a golden age. Under Elizabeth's reign, England would become a major Protestant power, challenging Catholic Spain and France. The English Reformation that began with her parents' secret wedding would help create the British Empire and spread Protestant Christianity around the globe. The wedding of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn had consequences neither could have imagined. They thought they were solving a personal problem, Henry's need for a male heir and Anne's desire to be queen. Instead, they accidentally triggered one of the most significant religious transformations in European history. The Church of England that emerged from their marriage would become the mother church of Anglican Christianity worldwide. Today, millions worship in churches that trace their origins back to that secret ceremony in the Holbein Gate. Looking back nearly 500 years later, it's remarkable that so much historical change could flow from what seemed like a simple personal decision by two people in love who wanted to be together. Thanks for joining me on this incredible journey through history's most consequential wedding. If you enjoyed discovering how a single secret ceremony transformed an entire kingdom's religion, make sure to subscribe for more amazing stories about the moments that changed our world. Don't forget to comment below and let us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from viewers around the globe.